Welcome back to Hot Flashes and Cool Topics. Today we are talking to Ellie Kaplan, who is the founder of Neurotrack. And Neurotrack is a digital exam to screen brain health and cognitive health. So, welcome to the show, Ellie.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, thank you for being here. This hits us personally because my mother-in-law has Alzheimer's and Bridget's father-in-law has Alzheimer's. And it seems like it's becoming more prevalent, maybe just because it's hitting us personally. But why don't we start with what is the state of research right now that is changing in the world of Alzheimer's disease?
It's a really important question because there is just a tremendous amount of new activity in the Alzheimer's space, and it's an exciting time. It's a time of, I think, finally real hope. So there have been some big changes in the market, so to speak, that's driving some of this change. First and foremost, there was a drug called Leqembi, which was developed by Eisai in partnership with Biogen, that is the first what they call disease-modifying drug to get full approval by the FDA and will be covered. The majority of costs will be covered by Medicare. So the simple fact that we have one drug on the market is transformative from the perspective of the fact that what it says to other biotech and large pharmaceutical companies is there's a market here. And what we're seeing is that other big pharma companies are now starting to shift resources into neuro programs in order to try to get access to that. Eli Lilly has a drug that will also likely get approval before the end of the year. So two new drugs on the market that are good starter drugs. And I would say the other thing that has happened is that Medicare put in place for people over the age of 65 new regulations that say that everyone must get a cognitive test as part of their annual physical. And so primary care doctors are now being told that they need to start testing people at scale. So everyone in their population who they see over the age of 65 must now get a cognitive test. And they've put in place new reimbursement codes to really incentivize them to do that. So there's momentum in the market. Behind those two drugs that I mentioned, there's a pipeline of about 150 other drugs that are very promising. So for the first time, I think we have a lot to be hopeful about, and that's important because, as you mentioned, prevalence is astronomical.
Right. With the prescriptions that are approved right now and some that are in the pipeline right now, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, that they are good for the beginning stages. Is that correct? In later stages, maybe it won't work for that. Is that right?
That's right. So as you both likely know from your personal experience, Alzheimer's disease has a trajectory. It is a disease that starts with what they call subjective memory complaint with worry, where you're just noticing that you are forgetting more and more things, and you gradually decline until you get to a place where you can't remember anything at all, including, your body, the brain stops functioning because it can no longer pump blood through your veins and allow you to breathe. The drugs that have been approved are indicated for people with mild cognitive impairment. That's when they work the best. And so, therefore, all the more reason to be testing people earlier so that, anyone who is in that earlier phase can get access to them. Once you have full frank Alzheimer's disease, there really aren't any options, unfortunately. The hope is that we start to catch it much earlier to keep people from progressing to that stage.
And that's why I think it's so important that we talk about Neurotrack, which you are the founder of, because it's a screening that's like 3 minutes, can be done at your annual appointment with your doctors. Can you talk about how Neurotrack came to be and what it does?
Absolutely. So, like both of you, I had two grandparents, my grandfather first, who started to show signs of Alzheimer's disease. And when we went through the process of trying to better understand what was going on with him, get a potential diagnosis, it was just really challenging. We couldn't get in to see a neurologist. And keep in mind, I come out of a family of healthcare workers. So, my dad is a doctor. My grandfather was a doctor, family filled with people with good access to physicians. And nonetheless, it was really challenging to get a diagnosis. Once we finally did, there were no drugs. And then about 5 years later, my grandmother on the other side of my family started to show similar signs. And I remember thinking at the time, well, this is awful, but things must be better now. And we went through the exact same experience. And it just struck me kind of, I was a relatively recent MBA graduate. And so I sort of, was thinking about like, wow, there are a lot of people who are getting older, and wow, this is a disease that, affects a lot of people. And we're doing a really bad job of identifying who's at risk and developing drugs. There must be an opportunity there to build a business and also do some good at the same time. And so that was when I really sort of went down this rabbit hole of trying to understand what the market looked like and what the tools were that were available. And I met my two co-founders who developed technology that was digital and had just been validated through a 6-year longitudinal study, where using this tool, they could identify who would go on to convert along that trajectory towards Alzheimer's disease. Fast forward to today, after founding the company and raising capital, we've now built out a whole suite of products. So we have our 3-minute screening test, which you mentioned, which is a really powerful tool from an accuracy perspective at identifying people who are healthy versus having mild cognitive impairment, which is kind of that middle early phase of the disease, and Alzheimer's disease. And so because it's short, it makes it possible for it to live in the primary care setting. And, we all know, and this was became even more apparent during COVID, the burden that primary care doctors are under to do so many things during that one little visit. And the time that a doctor has with a patient seems to get shorter and shorter, by the day. So most primary care docs, or many, get only 20 minutes. And so if you start to think about how am I going to test a patient for something like cognitive decline or Alzheimer's disease in that 20-minute period, when the old tools that have existed take the entire time of the exam, it's just a non-starter. So this test was really designed to work in the primary care setting, so that anybody who's worried about their cognitive health, whether it's because they're getting older or because they have a family history, can get tested and get access to real information about it.
So if I were to go and say I wanted this test done, what would my visit typically look like, except for, the normal checking everything else? Yep. But what would happen if I were to get this test?
Yep, it's a great question. So when you sell into healthcare, you have to work within their constraints, like with anything, right? And so we have designed it to make it as easy as possible for the doctor's office to start to use it, to integrate it into their system. So, Bridget, you would go to the doctor, you'd walk in, they'd bring you back to the room. They call that the rooming period, when the medical assistant is capturing all of your vitals. So, your weight, your height, your blood pressure. At the very end of taking all of that information, they would then hand you an iPad that is loaded with our screening test. You would take the test. There's a brief period at the very beginning where we give you instructions, and then we actually give you a practice period, because we really want to make sure that everybody understands exactly how the test works and what they're being asked to do. And then the testing starts, and the testing period is actually just 2 minutes. So we allow a little time for the instructions and everything else. You take the test, your results will automatically get uploaded into the electronic medical records system, and such that when the doctor then comes in, they have all of the information that they need to tell you what will come next. For you, Bridget, they'll say you passed with flying colors,
Yeah.
fine. You'll come back in a year and take the test again. But if that's not the case for someone and they get flagged by our test, then they would go on to do additional testing. And if from that testing, it looks like there's, something going on with their cognitive health, they would then get referred on to neurology. We have also developed, the deeper dive into the more comprehensive testing. And then we've also developed what we call our digital our cognitive and behavioral health program, which is a digital program that has taken all of the best in class science around what one can do from a lifestyle perspective in order to, to stabilize their cognitive health. And what we have learned is that there is a tremendous amount of things that people can do in order to do that. It focuses largely on what you eat. So a Mediterranean-based diet, or something called the MIND diet, how often you exercise, staying socially and cognitively engaged, getting a lot of sleep, all of those things we give to the patient in order to help them manage their cognitive health.
I have so many questions about this because honestly, if someone said to me, let's take a cognitive test, first thing I think of is my brain fog from menopause and hormonal changes is going to make me fail. And I don't know if it's going to be the brain fog or cognitive decline. So how does the test accurately distinguish between natural aging and a cognitive decline?
That's a really important question. And it's one that women who are perimenopausal or menopausal ask me all the time, because brain fog is a real thing. And we are going to start working with a very interesting menopause-focused company that is helping women sort of distinguish between what is brain fog and what could be early onset Alzheimer's disease. We've spent the last 10 years developing our science in order to be able to differentiate between something like brain fog and true cognitive decline and Alzheimer's disease. And it speaks to the way the test has been developed and the validation that we have done in order to show that we can do that. And we now have 26 peer-reviewed publications. We're FDA Class 2 medical device registered. We've got a deep patent portfolio and lots of real-world evidence that shows how we do that. And it speaks to the way the brain functions in terms of the things that we're measuring. So what we measure is not for Alzheimer's disease. Actually, we measure cognitive domains. So the things that are different, the functions that make up these cognitive domains are things like attention and executive function and brain processing speed and then memory. And so because we're measuring the function of those cognitive domains, we're able to discern between something like brain fog and something like Alzheimer's disease.
Okay. Yeah. So like, Colleen, when you and I can't remember the name of something, and then 2 hours later, it just pops in our head while we're eating lunch. That's
That's right.
Yeah, because that is a real worry. And I know a lot of women, like you said, at this stage in their life think something is going on with me. We hear that. We've heard that so many
times. It's
Yes.
early onset. It's early onset because we
Right.
just can't remember.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And early onset is relatively rare. So, for your listeners who may be experiencing brain fog related to menopause or perimenopause, it's pretty rare that it's Alzheimer's disease. And we know that brain fog is something that goes with menopause. And very often for women who are good candidates for hormone replacement therapy, when you go on to HRT, the brain fog will disappear. That said, menopause, there is a correlation between menopause and Alzheimer's disease longer term, not early onset, but in later in life. And the reason for that is that estrogen is protective of the brain. And so when you go through menopause and your brain is then starved of that protective estrogen, it becomes a risk factor for cognitive decline and Alzheimer's disease later on. That's not to be confused with brain fog that you may be experiencing in the moment. So HRT can be extremely helpful as a risk, in order to manage your risk for Alzheimer's disease. And I like to talk about the fact that I use it for that very reason, because I have a family history of Alzheimer's, and I'm terrified that, obviously I'm terrified that I will one day get it, but also that it could be caused by, by menopause or the reduction of estrogen in my brain. And that is such an easy thing to fix now that there's no reason not to, provided that from an other health perspective, you're a good candidate for it.
What about telehealth? How are you all involved in the telehealth world?
So, we're a great partner for telehealth companies because our test is digital. So as an example, if you are either, there are a number of companies that are popping up now that are doing teleneurology in order to help manage the scarcity of neurologists that exist and the need for dementia care and that sort of thing. So we work well in that format, but we also work well in a primary care setting where, we're starting to see that more annual wellness visits, oddly so, your annual physical could be conducted by telehealth. Then we can just simply send the test ahead to the patient to take.
So you use eye tracking for the test. Can you explain? Because I would immediately think, oh, you're going to give me questions that repeat these numbers or something like that. But you actually use eye tracking device. Can you talk about that?
Well, we use eye tracking as part of the comprehensive battery. We don't use it in the screening because the tests that we have developed for screening, test different things than what the eye tracking test tests. But in the comprehensive battery, we do use a test that employs eye tracking. And that is based on the original IP or test that my co-founders developed. It is a test that measures what you look at, how often you look at different images that get displayed while the test is being administered, in order to really get at some of the very deep neurobiology that in the part of the brain that houses memory. So the hippocampus is where all of our memory is stored. And the eye tracking test uses something called visual-based comparison in order to measure the function of the hippocampus. And so that's what's going on in that test. And I can explain how it works in more detail if that would be helpful, but high level, that's what it is.
Wow. I mean,
this is all so
wild. That's so fascinating to me that somebody figured out how to do that. It just blows my mind.
Right. Thank goodness for science, right?
I know. That is amazing.
You also talk about the fact that the test is culturally agnostic symbols and it's not dependent on your age. How did you get that way? Like, how can you give a test? People are so different. How do you get it so that everyone recognizes the symbols or the different questions?
Yeah. So that is one of the most important components of our screening test, but also our other tests, just being, generally speaking, being culturally agnostic, being education agnostic, being what they call language agnostic, because, first and foremost, Alzheimer's disease is a disease that disproportionately impacts women, but also Black Americans, Hispanic Americans, and people of lower education levels and socioeconomic classes, so to speak, or levels. There's a lot of science that goes into why that is. But if you think about the fact that the majority of the people who are affected by this disease historically have not been able to, one, get access to testing, which is a huge problem in and of itself. But two, when they do get access to testing, the tests have not been designed in order to accurately collect information on them because of their cultural, racial background or education level or ethnicity. And so when we set out to design particularly the screening test, it was really important to us to have a test that could accurately capture the true cognitive health of anyone taking the test. It was, good for business, but it's also really important from a values and access perspective, which is core to our values as a company. And so the way that we do that is by not employing sophisticated language or even unsophisticated language. It's by using, as you said, symbols that anyone anywhere can recognize. So things like a star or a heart or a fish or a cross are tied to different numbers. So, most people know the numeric system, regardless of culture, ethnicity, education level, and people can recognize symbols. And so, even if you have a third grade education, you can take our test and perform as well as somebody with a college education, provided all other things are equal. And we have worked really hard to make that possible.
Now, as a former teacher, that is such an important thing. And just when you said you even give 1 minute for someone to practice the test, that is so important. When I was teaching, you wanted, it's not like you were trying to teach the test, just how to take the test is so
That's
important.
Right.
Yeah.
And also, that part of it actually can last as long as the patient needs. It's not stopped at a minute. So, we call it a 3-minute test, but if somebody needs longer to go through the instructions in the practice period, they can take much longer. It's just at steady state. That's about what it is.
Right.
And the test is so relatively new. How has the response been from the doctors that you have reached out to?
Great. And the reason why, first and foremost, is because it fits in their clinical workflows. And, that's sort of healthcare jargon a bit, although most people get that. But the most important thing when any particularly primary care provider is contemplating using something new, it has to work in their system. And healthcare, feels chaotic to all of us and feels like a mess, particularly in the US, but it is kind of a very well-oiled machine when it comes to what happens once a patient is brought back to the room and the processes that they use. And so if you don't have a tool that fits within that process, it is just off the bat, it's a non-starter. And so the fact that it's short, that it integrates with their electronic medical record system, it's very easy to train a medical assistant on how to, what to look for and how to talk to the patient about the test. And then very easy for the patient to take. That's kind of the first big hurdle that anyone would face. And we do very, very well with that. And then when doctors understand how accurate it is, and the fact that it really empowers them to have a very hard conversation with a patient and give them insightful information that they can trust, it's a non-starter. And then, many healthcare providers and health systems are struggling from a financial perspective. So when they see that they can also actually make a bit of money on it, it usually that usually helps too.
How widespread are across the country can people access this test?
So, we are making very rapid gains in this area. It's early days, just for Alzheimer's generally, going to that first question that you asked. We just got our first drug Medicare just put in place these new regulations around testing. So we're going as fast as we can. It's, I mean, we still have a bunch of work to do, but you can find us in many states. And if you can't and you want it, call us and tell us who your doctor is, and we'll go make it happen. So, we want to be everywhere and anywhere that anyone needs a cognitive test.
What about those people who, like you just said, can't get it from a doctor? Is there any way that they can take the test online, or it has to be facilitated through a physician?
So it doesn't have to be facilitated through a physician. We like for it to be facilitated through a physician because sometimes, there are really hard conversations that you have to have after you take the test. And that's better done with somebody else. As a company, we have gone back and forth over the years about whether to sell it or make it available direct to consumer or not, for that very reason. And, for the fact that being a direct to consumer company in healthcare is a tough road. People don't love to pay for healthcare out of pocket. And, it's expensive to run a direct to consumer healthcare company. That said, as I mentioned, access is core to who we are. I started this company because we couldn't get testing for my grandparents, and I don't want anyone to ever face that again. And so, I always say that if somebody really wants access to the test, they can email me. My email is leelli@neurotrack.com, and we'll figure it out because I think it's really important.
And how has the response? I know we talked about Medicare before, and that they have started cognitive testing for health. But what about those of us who aren't quite Medicare age? Will it be covered by insurance, or is that something still in the works?
No, it will be covered by insurance, but you have to ask for it. So you have to go to your doctor and say, I'm worried. Here's why I'm worried. I'm going through menopause and I'm experiencing this brain fog and I don't know what it is. And if you say you're worried, they should give you a test. And if it's deemed, medically necessary to rule something out, then it'll be covered through just your commercial fee-for-service insurance company.
That is good to know. Just because if you, like you said, you've had grandparents, if you have this family history, that is something, just one thing maybe off your mind. And then if you do show signs, then you can start the process.
That's exactly right.
And like you were saying, women's healthcare, women are more likely to get Alzheimer's than men, yet women's healthcare is not funded properly as it should be. So options like these are so important to be made aware of. And we appreciate the fact that you've created this company, that it's an option for a lot of us to take things should be proactive. You should be going to the doctor, not just for symptoms, but for proactive longevity and feeling healthy. So thank you so much for creating Neurotrack. We will make sure in the show notes that the links to Neurotrack and all the other information we talked about will be included. Thank you so much for joining us, Ellie, and we appreciate all the work you've done.
Thank you so much for having me and getting the message out. It's really important for people to understand that they can take action when it comes to their brain health. They can get tested. They can start watching what they eat and how they exercise. There's a tremendous amount of hope right now. So no one should be despairing about this now.
Absolutely. We agree. Thank you.